Before we get started, I just wanted to point this out. I got some new products that I'm carrying, new razors. So if you're tired of the woke razor companies out there, stop on by uncletimsfarm.com. Check out my new products. Thanks. Hey, welcome to Wednesday's Word. This is part 3 of a 3-part series on unintended consequences. So 2 weeks ago, I talked about the king and the cheese and the mice and that whole silly story. And then last week was a true story about Daniel and the other leaders and the consequences there. It cost the lives of probably a little over around 100 men, plus the lives of their families too, their wives and their children. Anyhow, this is a similar story to last week, set probably somewhere close to the same time frame, maybe a little bit after Daniel. Anyhow, so this is about a man named Haman. And Haman worked for the king. Sorry about the pigs, they're a little excited. Anyhow, so this is a man named Haman, and he worked for the king. And he was elevated to a high position just like Daniel was. Now in this case, it wasn't the other people that were jealous, it was Haman. So whenever Haman would go out into the city and travel around, all the people would bow down to him and shake in their boots and, hide their faces from him, because he was this high official. He was second in command to the king, just like Daniel was. But there was one man who would not bow to him. This man was a Jewish man, and he would only bow to God. And so whenever Haman would go out, this man, whose name was Mordecai, would just stand there and watch Haman go by. And this just griped Haman. I mean, it really chapped his hide. He couldn't stand it. All the other subjects would bow down, get down on their hands and knees, put their faces to the ground, and wouldn't even look at him. And Mordecai would just stand there and watch him go by. And like I said, that sure griped Haman. And it just made him so mad, he'd go home and he'd complain to his wife and tell her what an awful guy this Mordecai was, just how annoying it was that he wouldn't bow to him. And day by day, this just grew, the anger and resentment grew for Haman towards Mordecai. Well, along the way, Mordecai got wind of a plot to kill the king, and so he made it known, passed that along, and the plot was foiled. And so the king had it written down, recorded in the official records, that Mordecai saved his life. And then it was kind of forgotten about until sometime later. So I keep getting them all mixed up, Haman and Mordecai. One day Haman went and was complaining to his wife and telling her about how he had everything in the kingdom. He was second only to the king, and he had everything and everyone was under his power, and he had all the riches he could want. But there was one thing that he would give it all up for, and that was to get even with Mordecai. Because Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him, none of it was worth it to him. He just couldn't stand it. So his wife, being the loving woman she was, says, well, why don't you build a gallows 50 feet tall, and then in the morning go to the king and have Mordecai hung. And Haman thought, that's an excellent idea. So he had a gallows built right outside his house, 50 feet high. Well, maybe it's cubits. Now I can't remember. Anyhow, very tall gallows built right outside of his house. So the next morning he got up to go to the king. Well, the night before, the king had been sleepless and he called some of his scribes or one of his servants to come and read to him from the official books. It just so happened that as he was reading, he came across the story of Mordecai saving his life. And so he wondered if anything had ever been done to pay Mordecai back for what he'd done to save his life. And they searched the records and found, nope, nothing had been done. So the king was thinking about that, trying to come up with something to do to reward him. Well, the next morning when Haman came walking in, the king asked Haman, Haman, what would you do for a man who you wanted to give great honor to and tell all the people what a wonderful guy he was? And Haman, thinking the king was talking about himself, said, well, I would take the king's horse, put him on that horse, put the king's robe on him, and dress him up all fancy and parade him through town and declare before all the people what a wonderful guy he was. And so the king said, that's an excellent idea, Haman. I want you to go get my horse and go find Mordecai, put him on the horse, put my robes on him, and lead him through town, and I want you to tell everybody how wonderful he is. Well, you can just imagine how much that burned Haman. Just griped him to have to take Mordecai and parade him through town after all the things he had done to him by not bowing down. So Haman went ahead and did it, paraded Mordecai through town, and when he went back to his wife, he was even more upset. He just couldn't believe it. So some time went by, and Mordecai, with some of his friends, Haman, along with some of his friends, came up with a plan to get rid of Mordecai once and for all. Because Mordecai was a Jew, Haman went to the king and said, King, there's a group of people that live in your kingdom, and they don't follow the same rules the rest of us do, and they don't worship the same gods that we do. We need to get rid of them. So if you'll let me write a decree that on such and such a day, all the people of the land, can go and attack them and kill them and wipe them out. And the king, being the brilliant guy he was, said, oh, that sounds like a good idea. So he went along with it. So Haman wrote this decree and sent it throughout all the land. Well, it just so happened that Mordecai's cousin happened to be the queen, and unbeknownst to the king, she was a Jew. So Mordecai went to Esther, his cousin, who was the queen, and talked to her and told her what was going to happen. So she went before the king and risked her life, because in order to go before the king without being called, it could be a death sentence. If the king didn't hold out his scepter to you, didn't accept you, you would be executed. So Esther went before the king, and he accepted her, and then she asked that both the king and Haman come to a banquet at her house. And so the next day the king and Haman came, and she fed them, gave them wine and buttered them up. And then the king said, what is it that you want? And she said, well, come back again tomorrow. So both Haman and the king came back again tomorrow, and she did the same thing. And at the end of that day, the king's like, what can I do for you? And she said, come back one more time. So she called him back again the next day and did the same thing. And once she had fed them and they had some really good wine, the king said, what can I do for you? And so then Esther told the king that there was a decree that was sent out to destroy her and all of her people. And the king said, what's this all about? And so she explained the whole story to him. And the king was so mad, he didn't even know what to say. So he walked away to ponder it and kind of get himself collected. And Haman stayed behind and fell on his knees before the Queen Esther, and was begging for his life. And the king came back in and saw this. And then he was really mad, because it looked like Haman was attacking the queen or trying to assault her. And so then the king had Haman executed, sent out, and had him hung on the very gallows that he had built for Mordecai, right there in front of his own house. And then the king said, what can I do for you, Esther? And so she went and spoke with Mordecai and came back and said, allow my people to be able to defend themselves on this day, because the decree had already gone out and couldn't be taken back, just like we learned last week. Some silly reason they would make a law, but then they couldn't take it back anyhow. So they couldn't take back a law, but another decree went out and said that the Jews were allowed to defend themselves on the day that this was to take place. So when that day rolled around, the Jewish people rose up and gathered together and defended themselves. And hundreds of people were killed on that day, 500 in just one town. And then the king came to Esther the next day and said, "What more can I do for you?" And she said, "Allow my people to be able to defend themselves again." And so they did again. And she said also, "I want you to execute Haman's sons." So they took Haman's 10 sons and they hung them on the same gallows that were intended for Mordecai. And then the Jewish people defended themselves, and over 75,000 people lost their lives trying to annihilate the Jews. So here we go again. One man's unintended consequences because he was jealous and angry at one man. He ended up costing the lives of himself, all of his sons, and over 75,000 people. Now that's some big time unintended consequences. So we all need to remember that. The next time that we're jealous or angry at somebody, and then, like I said last week, you want to stick it to them or get even with them, you might want to think again, because, last week it was a couple hundred people, and in this story it was over 75,000 people. That's a lot of people. So just keep that in mind. Sometimes it's better to keep things to yourself, or think about your motives for what you're doing. Anyhow, thanks for stopping by again, and we'll see you next week. And next week we'll probably have a talk that's not quite so morbid or dire or serious. We'll try to come up with something that's kind of fun. All right. Thanks a lot. See you next time.